Hello, my dear friend. It is truly wonderful to have you back with us on this journey of discovery here at Books and More. In a world that never seems to stop moving, our mission is to bring you the heartbeat of great books, distilling their most profound ideas so you can save time without ever losing the transformative essence of the original work. Today, I invite you to step away from the noise of the present and walk with me through the corridors of time. We often think of the past as something distant or cold, but history is actually the living mirror of who we are today. We are about to explore a remarkable work titled The History Book, a masterpiece that maps the vast tapestry of human existence from our very first footsteps to the complex, interconnected world we now inhabit. It is a story of survival, of brilliant ideas, and of the unyielding human spirit. As we turn these pages, have you ever wondered what silent whispers from the ancient world still guide your daily decisions? What drives a civilization to reach for the stars, and what leads it to eventually crumble back into the dust? And in the grand flow of empires and revolutions, where exactly do we find our own sense of belonging? Looking back at history is not just about learning facts. It is about finding perspective. It is a form of healing to realize that the struggles we face and the dreams we hold have been shared by millions of hearts across the centuries. You are part of a continuous, breathing story that is much larger than any single moment of doubt. I wish you a day filled with clarity and a peaceful soul. Now, let us begin this extraordinary journey together. Introduction: The meaning and evolution of history. The ultimate aim of history is human self-knowledge. In the words of the 20th century historian R.G. Collingwood, the value of history is that it teaches us what man has done, and thus what man is. We cannot hope to understand our lives without it. History itself has a history. From earliest times, all societies told stories about their origins, usually imaginative tales centering on the acts of gods and heroes. While literate civilizations kept records of their rulers, they made no initial attempt at a systematic inquiry into the truth. They did not differentiate between what had really happened and the events manifest in myth and legend. Systematic historical narrative began in the 5th century BCE with the ancient Greek writers Herodotus and Thucydides. Herodotus first used the word history to mean inquiry, and though his work still contained myth, Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War satisfies most criteria of modern study. He attributed events to human agency rather than divine intervention. This era also saw the rise of universal history, where historians like Polybius and Livy sought to describe progress as a story with a goal. In China, Sima Qian was similarly tracing thousands of years of history from the legendary Yellow Emperor to the Han Dynasty. Beyond recording facts, history has long served as a source of moral lessons. Writers such as Tacitus examined the behavior of heroes and villains to provide exemplars for the virtuous. During the European Middle Ages, this changed as events were viewed as divine providence. However, the Muslim world was often more sophisticated, with scholars like Ibn Khaldun railing against the uncritical acceptance of fanciful accounts. Meanwhile, Chinese historians produced work on a massive scale, such as a chronicle that filled nearly 300 volumes. Modern historiography evolved in Western Europe during the Renaissance, centered on the rediscovery of classical antiquity. The spread of printing made history available to a wider audience than ever before. By the 18th century, Enlightenment philosophers developed more sophisticated methodologies, dividing the past into ancient, medieval, and modern periods. In contrast, the Romantic movement found intrinsic value in the differences between the past and present, often searching for the roots of national identity and spirit. In the 19th century, history became an academic discipline and took on the quality of destiny. European civilization often saw itself as the goal of progress, leading to grand narratives by philosophers like Hegel and Marx. Academic history aspired to the status of a science, focusing on the accumulation of facts. The 20th century saw a further shift toward social history, expanding the subject matter to embrace the lives of common people and the patterns of everyday thinking. Until the second half of the 20th century, most world history was written as the story of the triumph of Western civilization. This Eurocentrism collapsed with post-colonial revisionism, which introduced a multiplicity of histories told from various points of view. Today, we reflect this abandonment of grand narratives of human progress. We aim to present world history through specific moments that act as windows into the past. We recognize the importance of key factors such as population growth, climate, and the environment. History is a process rather than a series of unconnected events, and it remains the fundamental discipline for understanding mankind. Human origins, from the first footsteps to the dawn of civilization. We believe that the origins of the human race lie in Africa. Through the usual processes of biological evolution, the genus Homo evolved in East Africa over millions of years. By about 200,000 years ago, modern humans, known as Homo sapiens, emerged alongside other relatives like the Neanderthals. At that stage, a group of humans would have been almost indistinguishable from other great apes. However, at a certain point that remains difficult to define precisely, we began to change in a new way. This was not a change of biology, but one of culture. We developed the ability to alter our way of life through the creation of tools, languages, beliefs, and art. By the time our ancestors were painting exquisite pictures of animals on cave walls or sculpting figurines from stone, we had marked ourselves out uniquely from all other animals. We became the only creatures with a history. The expansion of our species across the globe was a testament to human curiosity and creativity. The arrival of the first humans in Australia between 60,000 and 45,000 years ago was a journey of immense importance, comparable to the greatest explorations of the modern age. We spread across Eurasia, encountering other hominin species like the Neanderthals and the mysterious Denisovans. While there is evidence that we interbred with these cousins, Homo sapiens ultimately became the sole survivor. We believe our resourcefulness and extensive social networks allowed us to outcompete others, especially as we faced rapid climatic changes. The human journey eventually reached the Americas via Beringia, a land bridge exposed when sea levels dropped during the Ice Age. Vivid evidence of our developing minds can be found in Paleolithic culture. In places like the Altamira Cave complex in Spain, we find some of the best examples of Stone Age art. These paintings were so lifelike that they were initially dismissed as fakes. Whether these images were created for the sake of beauty, for spiritual rituals, or to communicate vital information about hunting, they show a sophisticated understanding of the environment. We also see the first signs of religious practice through complex burials and the creation of Venus figurines. These small sculptures of women, found widely across Europe, suggest shared cultural ideas and symbols that were crucial to social interactions. The relationship between humans and the environment was profoundly shaped by the late Ice Age. Around 21,000 BCE, a period of intense cold known as the Big Freeze occurred. As ice caps expanded, sea levels dropped and habitats changed. People and animals were forced to migrate or face extinction. When temperatures finally rose again around 7000 BCE, the melting ice separated continents and created new archipelagos, isolating many human groups. However, these new post-glacial forests and wetlands offered new opportunities. We began to manipulate our surroundings, burning vegetation to encourage certain plants and managing animal herds. This manipulation led to the most radical change in human history, the development of agriculture. This farming revolution, or the Neolithic Revolution, occurred between 10,000 and 7,000 BCE. In settlements like Catalhoyuk in central Turkey, we see the transition from foraging to a settled life. Agriculture allowed for a stable food source and a significant increase in population density. But this transition came with negative consequences as well. Early farmers often worked harder than hunter-gatherers and suffered from nutritional deficiencies due to limited diets. Living in close quarters with animals also led to the spread of new diseases like smallpox and the flu. Despite these challenges, the development of permanent villages forced us to find new ways to resolve social stresses and maintain community cohesion through formal religious organizations and rituals. By about 5,000 years ago, these settled communities began to form societies of unprecedented complexity. We saw the emergence of a hierarchy led by rulers and priests, supported by specialized workers like bureaucrats and traders. Manpower was coordinated to build defensive walls and huge temples. We developed irrigation systems to control the flow of great rivers. Administrative needs led to the invention of bookkeeping and the first known scripts, such as cuneiform in Sumer. This era also saw the birth of the first true cities, such as Uruk in Mesopotamia. As we moved from the Stone Age into the Bronze and Iron Ages, the foundations of the ancient world were firmly established. We had moved from a world of scattered bands to a world of states and empires, setting the stage for the rest of human history. Ancient civilizations, the rise of cities, codes, and conquerors. About 5,000 years ago, human society underwent a transformation of unprecedented complexity. We began to see the emergence of what we now call civilizations, characterized by state structures, social hierarchies, and the development of writing. The fundamental engine of this change was progress in agriculture. When our ancestors learned to produce enough food that not everyone had to work the fields, a new world opened up. Some became bureaucrats or traders, others became priests or scribes. This raised human life to new heights in technology, astronomy, and philosophy, but it also introduced a darker side to the human story: inequality, systemic exploitation, and large-scale warfare as small states expanded into vast empires. The earliest of these civilizations took root where intensive agriculture was possible through irrigation, particularly along the great rivers of Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, we see the very first true cities. It was here that Hammurabi, one of the great kings of Babylon, established one of the earliest known written legal systems. This was not just a list of rules, but a way to cement control over a region where local networks were breaking down. Hammurabi saw himself as the guarantor of a just and orderly society, and his code, carved on a 6-foot slab of black stone, covered everything from property disputes to violence against the person. In Egypt, a different tradition of power emerged. The pharaohs were viewed as living gods who controlled the very cosmos. Around 1264 BCE, Ramesses II built the massive temples of Abu Simbel to glorify his divine status and assert dominance over his neighbors. Egyptian kingship was defined by military might and supernatural strength, with the pharaoh often depicted as much larger than ordinary mortals. This unified civilization, protected by deserts and nourished by the Nile, developed a sophisticated and coherent culture that lasted for millennia, focused on the afterlife and monumental architecture. As we look toward the east, we find spiritual and political revolutions that still shape our world. In India, Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha, rejected the material life and the rigid strictures of Vedic ritual to preach a philosophy of enlightenment. Initially an elite pursuit, Buddhism became the state religion under the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka the Great. Ashoka had a profound change of heart after a series of bloody conquests, embracing a model of kingship based on tolerance and nonviolence. His missionaries took this faith across the Silk Road and into East Asia, making it one of the first truly global religions. In the Mediterranean, the Minoans on Crete were building elaborate palace complexes like Knossos, prospering through trade and developing early forms of writing long before the rise of classical Greece. But it was the Persian Empire under the Achaemenid dynasty that set the model for later empires. At its height, the Persian state may have ruled over half the world's population. Rulers like Cyrus the Great were innovative, allowing conquered peoples to keep their religions and cultures, creating a multicultural state held together by a vast network of roads. This Persian giant eventually clashed with the independent city-states of southern Greece. The Persian Wars profoundly influenced Greek identity, particularly in Athens. Here, a radical new idea took hold: democracy. Under leaders like Pericles, Athenian citizens were allowed to vote directly on policy. While this system was limited to adult male citizens and excluded women and slaves, it provided the model for modern electoral democracies. This era was also the crucible of Western philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle began to discover the workings of the natural world through reason rather than myth, setting the course for science and ethics for centuries to come. While the Greek city-states were defined by their independence, the Macedonian king Alexander the Great transformed them into the heart of a vast empire. In a daring military expansion, Alexander blazed a trail across the known world, fusing Greek culture with Eastern traditions. Though his empire was carved up by his generals after his death, the Hellenistic legacy endured, with Greek language and ideas spreading throughout the Middle East and as far as India. In China, the path to unity was forged by the will of one man, Qin Shi Huangdi. Before he unified the region in 221 BCE, China was a land of warring states. He imposed a strict governing philosophy known as legalism, centralizing power and ruthlessly enforcing unity through standardized scripts, coinage, and even the gauge of cart tracks. He built the first part of the Great Wall and was buried with an incredible army of terracotta warriors. Though his empire was short-lived, the Han Dynasty that followed built on these foundations, creating a coherent state that has endured for most of world history. Back in the West, Rome grew from a cluster of small villages into a Mediterranean superpower. For 500 years, it was a republic, governed by elected officials and a senate. However, this system was eventually challenged by the personal ambitions of powerful military men like Julius Caesar. His assassination in 44 BCE did not save the republic, but instead unleashed civil wars that led to the rise of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. He established a new imperial system that brought stability and the Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and prosperity across a vast stretch of territory. Under the Roman Empire, a minor religious sect based on the teachings of Jesus Christ began to grow. Despite periods of persecution, Christianity gained popularity and was eventually adopted by the Emperor Constantine after a vision at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He used the faith as a unifying force, founding a new capital at Constantinople and refashioning the church in the image of the Roman state. By the late 300s, Christianity had become the official religion of the empire. However, the ancient world eventually reached a point of decline. From the 3rd century CE, the powerful classical empires faced internal power struggles and external threats. The Western Roman Empire, weakened by economic decline and disease, was overwhelmed by the migration of Germanic tribes like the Visigoths and the arrival of the Huns. Rome fell to the Visigoths in 410 CE, a shock that sent ripples across the world. While the eastern portion of the empire survived for another millennium as the Byzantine Empire, Western Europe entered a period of transition. Successor states formed by Germanic tribes began to carve out new kingdoms, and the organized structure of the Roman world slowly gave way to the medieval era. This period of ancient civilizations left behind the bedrock of our modern languages, laws, and philosophies, proving that while empires may fall, the ideas they cultivate continue to shape the human journey. The medieval world, a global tapestry of faith and power. Historians often look at the period between the years 500 and 1500 and call it the Middle Ages, seeing it as a long bridge connecting the ancient world to the modern era. But we must understand that there was never a clean or sudden break. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed under the weight of barbarian invasions, the flame of Roman civilization continued to burn brightly in the East for another 1,000 years, rebranded by later scholars as the Byzantine Empire. From its capital in Constantinople, this empire survived the storms of the early centuries, retaining rich provinces like Egypt and eventually attempting to retake Rome itself under the energetic leadership of Emperor Justinian. However, this dream of a restored Roman glory was ultimately hollow, leaving Italy devastated and the empire crippled by debt and a terrifying plague. Perhaps the most transformative and distinctive characteristic of this era was the rise and confrontation of two great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. In the early 7th century, a merchant named Muhammad received a divine revelation in a cave near Mecca. Within just a few decades, his followers had unified the Arabian Peninsula and shattered the ancient Persian and Byzantine powers. They created a vast caliphate that stretched from the borders of China to the shores of Spain. Although this political unity eventually fractured into competing factions like the Sunnis and Shias, the religion itself ensured a continuity of civilization. Under the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, a golden age of scholarship began. The House of Wisdom became a global center for science and learning, where Greek philosophical texts were translated into Arabic, and Hindu mathematics, including the number 0, were adopted and refined. This intellectual tradition gave the Muslim world a lead of several centuries over Western Europe. In Western Europe, the story was very different. Civilization fell drastically from the levels reached under the Romans. Society was thinly spread and sustained by subsistence agriculture, constantly threatened by Viking warriors who mounted brutal raids on monasteries and coastal towns. In the absence of strong, centralized states, feudal relationships became the glue that held societies together. There was a lingering nostalgia for ancient Rome, which led to the crowning of the Frankish king Charlemagne as emperor in the year 800. While his empire did not long survive his death, the notion of a secular leader for Christendom allowed the office to endure in various forms for centuries. This led to a long and bitter struggle for supreme authority between the papacy and the monarchs, known as the investiture controversy. By the time this dispute was settled, the Church had established itself as a diplomatic power equal to any king, and the prestige of the Holy Roman Emperors was permanently damaged. As we move into the 11th century, the world began to witness an incredible expansion of culture and trade. In Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat, which remains the largest religious structure in the world. In West Africa, the Mali Empire rose to immense wealth through its control of the trans-Saharan gold trade. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, became a legend when he flooded the markets of Cairo with so much gold during his pilgrimage to Mecca that he accidentally depressed its value for years. In East Asia, the Ming dynasty in China restored native rule and sent out grand maritime expeditions under Admiral Zheng He to confirm Chinese prestige across the Indian Ocean. However, this growing connectivity also brought new kinds of conflict. The Crusades saw Christian knights surge into the Middle East to seize Jerusalem, sparking 2 centuries of warfare in the Holy Land. While these expeditions ultimately failed to hold their ground, they opened up European horizons to the luxury goods and superior science of the East. In the 13th century, the world was shaken by the rise of the Mongols. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, nomadic warriors from the steppes created a vast empire that spanned from China to Eastern Europe. This Mongol peace briefly made the Silk Road secure, allowing travelers like the Venetian merchant Marco Polo to reach the court of Kublai Khan. But the same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried a silent killer, the bubonic plague. Known as the Black Death, this epidemic killed over 1/3 of the population of Europe and the Middle East in the mid-14th century, fundamentally altering the economic and social landscape. Despite these catastrophes, the seeds of the modern world were being sown. In England, the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 established the revolutionary principle that even the king was subject to the law. In the Mediterranean, the Christian reconquest of Spain, known as the Reconquista, gathered pace, eventually leading to the fall of Granada in 1492. This was the same year that Christopher Columbus, seeking a new westerly route to the riches of the East, accidentally reached the Americas. His journey inaugurated a lasting contact between the Old World and the New, closing the door on the medieval era and opening a new chapter of global exploration and colonization. The medieval world was not a time of stagnant darkness, but a period of profound growth, religious fervor, and the birth of the nations and ideas that would eventually define our own time. The early modern era, a world transformed by discovery, reason, and global reach. The course of world events always looks different in retrospect than it did to those living through them. Today, we often view the centuries between 1420 and 1795 as the age when Europe began its climb toward world domination. Yet, to those alive at the time, the world frequently seemed full of unprecedented disasters. The unity of Christendom was shattered by the Reformation. Sectarian conflicts tore the continent apart, and the Muslim armies of the Ottoman Empire reached deep into the European heartland. This was a period of extreme contrasts where the infamous brutality of conquest and the misery of the slave trade existed alongside a magnificent flowering of arts, the birth of modern science, and a radical shift in how humans understood their place in the universe. The transformation began with the Renaissance, a movement centered on the rediscovery of the classical past. In Florence, Filippo Brunelleschi designed a groundbreaking dome that signaled a new era of human achievement. This was the dawn of humanism, which placed mankind at the center of the universe and celebrated human accomplishment rather than divine intervention. This intellectual shift was accelerated by the invention of the printing press. For the first time, ideas could circulate quickly and reach the masses, breaking the church's monopoly on knowledge and allowing literature to flourish in local languages. As these new ideas took hold, the horizons of the known world were also expanding. European rulers and merchants, hungry for Asian spices and luxury goods, sought new sea routes to bypass the hazardous land routes controlled by the Ottomans. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail westward across the Atlantic, hoping to reach Asia, but instead stumbling upon the Americas. This discovery initiated a permanent link between two entire ecosystems that had evolved in isolation for millennia. This Columbian exchange brought potatoes and maize to Europe, helping to end chronic food shortages. but it also brought Eurasian diseases that decimated indigenous American populations. To manage the competition for these new lands, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, a move that would influence the fate of vast swaths of the world for centuries. The wealth of the New World fueled the rise of global empires, but it also led to one of history's greatest crimes, the transatlantic slave trade. As European powers established plantations for sugar, coffee, and tobacco, they turned to the forced labor of millions of Africans. The Royal African Company and other merchant groups created a triangular trade network that enriched European economies while inflicting unspeakable oppression and death. This era saw the rapid rise of Western capitalism, exemplified by the opening of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where shares in international corporations were traded for the first time. While wealth flowed across the oceans, religious foundations in Europe were crumbling. In 1517, Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses against the Catholic Church, sparking the Reformation. This movement emphasized the authority of Scripture over the priesthood and led to the establishment of Protestant churches. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, using the zeal of the Jesuits and the emotional power of Baroque art to win back followers. The resulting tensions led to more than a century of religiously motivated conflict, most notably the 30 Years' War, which devastated mainland Europe before ending with the Peace of Westphalia and a new balance of power among independent nations. In the East, other great empires were reaching their peak. In India, the Mughal ruler Akbar the Great established a centralized political system and promoted a culture of religious tolerance. Persian and Indian art forms merged to create a unique style, evidenced by monuments like the Taj Mahal. In China, the Ming Dynasty brought 3 centuries of stability and administrative perfection, culminating in the construction of the Forbidden City. However, even these powerful states faced challenges. The Ming eventually collapsed in the face of a Manchu invasion, leading to the rise of the Qing dynasty. In Japan, the Battle of Sekigahara ushered in the Edo period, a time of unity and artistic achievement under the Tokugawa shoguns, who largely isolated the country from Western influence to maintain stability. Warfare itself was becoming very different during this period. The military revolution, driven by the invention of more efficient firearms and heavy cannons, signaled the decline of the feudal system. Armored knights and bowmen were replaced by disciplined infantry and professional armies. Kings began to centralize their power to pay for these expensive new militaries. In France, Louis XIV became the ultimate absolute monarch, while in England, the struggle for power between the crown and parliament led to the English Civil War and the shocking execution of King Charles I. This event briefly turned England into a republic and challenged the ancient doctrine of the divine right of kings. As the era progressed, a new spirit of inquiry took hold. The scientific revolution, led by figures like Isaac Newton, showed that the universe was governed by natural, rationally understandable laws. This paved the way for the Enlightenment, a multifaceted intellectual movement that championed reason over dogma. Thinkers like Voltaire and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued for individual freedom, equality, and the separation of politics from religion. Denis Diderot sought to catalog all human knowledge in his Encyclopédie, a work that challenged traditional social and religious ideas. These Enlightenment ideals were not just academic, they became the fuel for revolution. In 1776, the American colonies declared their independence, asserting that all men are created equal and that government must derive its power from the consent of the governed. While these ideals were initially imperfect, ignoring the rights of women and the reality of slavery, they formed the bedrock of modern liberal political systems. By the end of the 18th century, the modern world was under construction in the European mind. Russia was westernizing under Peter the Great, the Ottoman Empire was beginning its slow decline, and the stage was set for a century of even more radical social and industrial change. The early modern era closed as a period that had successfully connected the continents, revolutionized human thought, and laid the foundations for the globalized society we live in today. Changing societies, the era of revolution, industry, and empire. From the late 18th century, history took on an air of progress that seemed to have a clear direction. Change accelerated, and the world population exceeded 1 billion for the first time. This era was defined by a series of political, industrial, and social revolutions that fundamentally altered how humans lived and saw themselves. It began with a daring assertion of statehood, the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This act created a new nation and articulated principles of human rights and equality that would resonate across the globe. Soon after, in 1789, the storming of the Bastille signaled the start of the French Revolution. This movement overthrew the absolute monarchy and established a new social order based on the principles of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Although it later degenerated into the violence of the Terror, the French Revolution permanently weakened Europe's traditional aristocracies and inspired democratic movements everywhere. The ripples of these revolutions spread far beyond Europe. In South America, Simón Bolívar led a series of wars for independence against the Spanish crown, striving to create a unified republic of Gran Colombia. But while some fought for political freedom, others remained enslaved. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in Britain, leading to the 1807 Act that outlawed the slave trade, though slavery itself would not be banned in the British Empire until 1833. In the United States, the contradictions of a nation conceived in liberty yet dependent on slavery led to the American Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address redefined the conflict as a struggle to guarantee equality for all, eventually leading to the total abolition of slavery and a new birth of freedom for the country. While political maps were being redrawn, a silent revolution was transforming the very fabric of existence. The Industrial Revolution, powered by the steam engine and coal, began to change societies from agricultural ones to industrial ones. In 1830, George Stephenson's rocket heralded a new form of faster, more reliable transport, linking cities and markets. This economic output was driven by scientific advances that created a sense that the world could be better understood and exploited. But industrialization brought significant social challenges. Huge numbers of workers were drawn to rapidly expanding cities, often living in extreme squalor and facing miserable working conditions. This created a new urban underclass and led to the rise of socialism and labor movements, which sought to end the inequalities accelerated by industrial capitalism. The mid-19th century was also a time of profound intellectual change. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, introducing a controversial theory of evolution that challenged long-held religious beliefs about the creation of life. This scientific revolution emphasized human reason and skepticism, helping to define the Enlightenment spirit of the age. However, these ideas were sometimes warped to justify imperialism and racism. Western powers, fueled by their industrial strength and a sense of moral superiority, began a scramble for Africa and a relentless expansion into Asia. At the Berlin Conference in 1884, European nations carved up the African continent, largely ignoring local cultures and histories. In the East, different nations reacted to Western pressure in different ways. China, once the world's most powerful country, found itself humiliated and bankrupt after the Opium Wars, which forced it to grant trading concessions to the West. In contrast, Japan underwent the Meiji Restoration in 1868. By ousting the shogunate and adopting Western political and financial systems, Japan transformed itself into a dynamic industrial and military power within just 30 years. By the turn of the century, Japan had even defeated a major European power, Russia, signaling a shift in the global balance of power. As we reached the late 19th century, the world was more interconnected than ever. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 dramatically reduced sailing times between Europe and the East, facilitating a global economy. Major new railways, such as the Trans-Siberian, opened up vast territories. This was the Belle Epoque, a time of civic pride and technological progress, symbolized by the opening of the Eiffel Tower in 1889. Yet beneath this surface of prosperity, tensions were simmering. Nationalism was rising across Europe, leading to an arms race and a complex web of alliances that threatened wider instability. The era concluded with a world dominated by Western empires, yet facing internal challenges from those seeking rights and representation. The women's suffrage movement, exemplified by the militant tactics of the suffragettes in Britain and the death of Emily Davison in 1913, highlighted that the promise of equality was still unfulfilled for many. We look back at this century as one of incredible transformation, where humanity gained immense power over the natural world and redefined political systems, but also laid the groundwork for the devastating global conflicts that would follow in the 20th century. Changing societies showed us that while progress can bring great wealth and freedom, it can also lead to deep divisions and unforeseen consequences that we are still grappling with today. The modern world, from the crucible of war to the digital age. Historical perspectives on events close to our own time are inevitably shifting and uncertain. A historian writing in the mid-20th century might have characterized the modern era as a period of catastrophe, where the economic and political gains of liberal civilization were squandered. However, as we moved into the 21st century, it became tempting to see a thread of continuity with the pre-1914 world, where a globalized capitalist economy and great technological innovation are combined with rapidly rising population and productivity. I look back at this century as one of extremes, where the absolute worst of human nature clashed with our greatest aspirations for freedom and knowledge. The era began with the shattering of old illusions in 1914. World War I was a conflict on an epic scale that tarnished the traditional 19th century idea of progress. In the mud of Passchendaele, soldiers often found themselves wishing for death rather than the reality of the trenches. When the fighting finally stopped, the Treaty of Versailles was signed. But as Ferdinand Foch famously observed, it was not a peace but merely an armistice for 20 years. The war redrew the map of the world, but left deep scars of resentment. In the midst of this global slaughter, Russia was transformed by the October Revolution of 1917. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power with a simple but potent promise of peace, land, and bread. They established the world's first socialist state, an experiment that was meant to provide an alternative to capitalism, but eventually descended into the brutal dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. Under his rule, the Soviet Union underwent rapid industrialization at a staggering human cost, including state-sanctioned famines and purges. Back in the West, the 1920s brought a brief age of prosperity and consumerism in the United States, but this confidence was foolishly misplaced. The Wall Street crash of 1929 plunged the world into the Great Depression, proving that global capitalism could fail effectively and catastrophically. This economic misery provided the perfect breeding ground for extremist ideologies. In Germany, Adolf Hitler used the Reichstag fire of 1933 as a pretext to curb civil liberties and establish a fascist regime. He argued that men were tired of liberty and sought solutions in national pride and racial purity. The inevitable result was the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939, triggering World War II. This was the deadliest conflict in history, characterized by the horrors of the Holocaust and the systematic annihilation discussed at the Wannsee Conference. It was a total war where civilian populations were as much in the front line as soldiers. The conflict ended only after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, ushering in a new and terrifying nuclear age. In the aftermath of the war, the victors found themselves divided by an Iron Curtain. The Cold War became the defining geopolitical struggle of the late 20th century, a battle of ideology between the democratic West and the communist East. We saw the world teeter on the edge of nuclear destruction during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a moment when the superpowers were eyeball to eyeball until one side finally blinked. Yet, while the great powers remained in a stalemate, a different kind of revolution was sweeping the globe, the end of empires. Starting with Indian independence and partition in 1947, European colonial powers were forced to recognize that change was inevitable. Under leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi, India awoke to life and freedom. In Africa, Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, signaling a domino effect that would see most of the continent free by the 1970s. However, decolonization was often born in violence, from the struggles in Vietnam to the ongoing conflict over the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. The 1960s brought a surge of radical politics and social change. People were no longer content with the status quo. Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a dream of racial equality during the March on Washington, while students in Paris and across the world took to the streets in 1968 to question authority and demand a more just society. We also began to look beyond our own planet. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 initiated a space race that culminated in Neil Armstrong's small step on the moon in 1969. The late 20th century saw the sudden and unexpected collapse of communism. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost and perestroika reduced Cold War tensions and allowed the people of Eastern Europe to reclaim their destinies. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was swept aside, and shortly after, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated into 15 separate states. For a brief moment, some thought we had reached the end of history and the final triumph of liberal democracy. But the 21st century has brought its own set of challenges. On September 11, 2001, our very way of life came under attack from Islamic extremists, leading to a new era of global insecurity and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The global financial crisis of 2008 brought the world's financial system close to collapse once again, highlighting the persistent inequalities of a globalized economy. In the Middle East, the hopes of the Arab Spring in 2011 often turned to the tragedies of civil war and a massive refugee crisis. Amidst these political upheavals, a technological revolution has fundamentally changed how we share information and conduct business. In 1991, Tim Berners-Lee launched the first website, and since then, the internet has become a global telecommunications tool used by billions. We now affect the world by what we browse, and smartphones have made the internet a mobile resource that can undermine regimes and organize protests in real time. As I conclude this narrative, the world population has exceeded 7 billion. We live in a world of incredible progress in medicine and literacy, yet we face the growing emergency of climate change and environmental destruction. Scientists warn that we are passing thresholds that may be irreversible. History offers no solid ground for predictions, only the lesson that the unexpected is to be expected. The journey of the human family continues, and the events we experience today will shape the history of tomorrow. We must remain curious and vigilant, for we are not just the observers of history, but the makers of it. If you like this video, please hit the like and subscribe button so that more people can know about it. Thank you for your support. Wishing you a pleasant evening and happiness with your family. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.